thinking through the book of 1 Corinthians. Where do these terms belong on our chart? So again, think to yourself for a minute or so, and then we'll go over these, just a little bit of a review before we start. Robert, we're live on the YouTube as well. Welcome to everyone joining us via live stream. And for you folks, remember there is also material on the website under Media, Bible Class Material. And so access that if you don't have it yet. Okay, really, if you remember, you're just answering top or bottom of our volcano chart here. So really, you could have a 50-50 chance. Actions. Do actions go on the top or the bottom of our chart? They go on the top. Actions are the spewing of the volcano. Attitudes? They're on the bottom. The attitudes are the underlying movements of the lava, so to speak, or the tectonic plates that are shifting. What about behavior? Behavior is top. Goes with actions. Beliefs? Yeah, they go below. And this is basically it. I mean, this is what we were driving at on Sunday, that what you believe, what's in your heart, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Somebody said that. And what within you, what you believe to be true, the attitude you have, your heart, your mind, that then drives what comes out. The behavior, what you do, how you walk, how you speak, the actions that you take, so on and so forth. So these last two terms then are more like the remedy. Principles. Do principles remedy the top or the bottom? They remedy the bottom. The principles, that's how you change your belief, your kind of foundation, so to speak. And then rules, what does that remedy? Yeah, the rules go on top. They remedy the behavior. So the framework of the book, as we're suggesting or proposing for studying 1 Corinthians, is this: that in Corinth there are wrong attitudes, and that leads to, or is leading to in Corinth, wrong behavior, and that is what is causing the problems there that Paul is addressing. So the solution that Paul is getting at throughout the book has to do with going to the core, going to the root of the problem, addressing the attitudes first, trying to get those right so that the behavior can be right and so that the church can have success, again, in the terms that we would define church success. So this is the framework. Attitudes and actions determine the fruit that will be born in the individual's life, of course, but in the context of 1 Corinthians, we really are focusing on the life of the church, the life of the community together. And this framework also ties into our goals, how we are going about seeking knowledge and growing and improving in this class. Ultimately, we do want to change our actions, like Paul ultimately wants the Corinthians to change their actions. But we don't just want to change our actions. We don't want just to involve ourselves in behavior modification. We want to change the way that we think, and then from that, change the way that we live. And so from getting more familiar with the book of 1 Corinthians, knowing where things are, knowing the outline, knowing the discussion topics, we want to understand the problems in Corinth. What are the issues? What's really going on? Remember, this is sometimes trickier than other times. I mean, anyway, we'll get to that. But do some work to figure out what are the problems in Corinth. Do some work to figure out what principles are Paul getting across, and then how do those principles apply to the problems in Corinth, and then how do those applications make sense in my life, and then in our church setting, how do we take the applications of 1 Corinthians and apply them, synthesize them with our own situation. Okay, that's the goal, and we're doing that by spending the first third of the class doing what I'm referring to as cross-sections in the book. And the cross-sections are looking at, if you have your booklet, again, this is the importance of having a booklet, you'll see that so far, that's really all you have in your booklet, are these various collections of verses. And each of these collections gives you a sampling of verses throughout the book of 1 Corinthians, and the point is to see the threads, see what different ideas pop up from chapter to chapter across the book, and understanding those threads, understanding those themes, those big ideas that run under the surface, so to speak, in 1 Corinthians will then, I think, help us quite a bit when we start going through in a few weeks, going through chapter by chapter and looking at each of these topics in more detail. Okay, so have your booklet. Again, there are still booklets on the back table, so please get one so that you can use this time productively. But we are going to, hopefully you've looked at this some already at home, but we're going to take a few minutes to look at cross-section number 2. So we've done number 0 on last Wednesday. We did number 1 on Sunday, and we're going to do cross-section number 2 together. So take a few minutes to look at that in your booklet. Use the questions on the screen, which are the same as the questions in your book, as guiding questions, and look for the thread. What is the idea in these sets, this set of verses that is emphasized throughout the book of 1 Corinthians? Take some time to look at that, work on that independently, and then we will all come together and talk about it. Okay, for the next several minutes, I want to hear from you all what you see in these verses. And you can really comment on any of these questions here, identifying what the theme is in these verses as you see it, but also feel free to elaborate on why that might matter, why that may be significant to our study of 1 Corinthians, that this particular thing or another is emphasized. So we do have a couple guys up and ready to bring the microphone to you. So if we can get, even if someone else is talking, you can raise your hand and the other mic will come to you. That would be more efficient. But what do you see in these verses here? Who wants to get the ball rolling here? Lee, what do you got?
I think the main thing you see is strife and contention, and the idea that differences of opinion were leading to open division and strife, even to lawsuits and various things that Paul addresses. But they were told to be one body in chapter 12. That, and of course, as I was reading chapter 12, I thought, well, they were already set up. I mean, there were already divisions just based on some pretty basic things that we talked about a lot in the Galatians class, you know, the Jews versus Greeks. So they were already, and it talks about in verse 13 of chapter 12, you know, Jew and Greek, slave or free, they were all called to be one body. And there was a built-in dynamic of conflict to start with just based on their background, but they were supposed to ignore that. And that was hard for them. It's hard for us sometimes too.
Okay. Thank you, Lee. Other thoughts on what you see here in these verses?
Similar to Lee, maybe too simplistic. I put the call for unity.
Call for unity. Thank you, Jordan. Other observations that you made, connections that you made, or implications perhaps from the ideas here for understanding the book of 1 Corinthians. Albert, what you got?
See where this behavior is expected in this world, but definitely never should it be a part of us as Christians, to where we're at court with each other. You know, listening today, you know, is there not one person wise enough to be able to handle the problem that we have to go out to this world to get it resolved? So it's just behavior that is totally unbecoming of Christians, can be expected in the world, but definitely should not be a part of our lives. Many things in here.
Thank you, Albert. Other things. So we have Lee talks about the strife, the contention, and the contrast between that and the body imagery that's used, as well as perhaps the dynamic of the church already, maybe having been set up with that as a possibility, and that has given way to a bad circumstance. Jordan talks about a call for unity, and then Albert points out that these behaviors that Lee and Jordan both talked about are not part of God's plan for his people. They exist out there, but not in here. Yes, sir, Jordan.
So Brian Haley has, we are a temple of God united to one another.
A temple of God united, that shows up here, and again, connects with what Jordan said about a call for unity, and also to what Albert said about the distinction that's made among God's people. Okay? Other things, I'm giving you any chance you want here. You guys know I'll talk. That's no surprise. Okay, I'll talk all you want me to talk, but would love to hear from you. So let's look at some things in this. It is divisions. That's the answer, by the way. Remember that line at the top of your page under cross-section number 2, as with the other weeks, that is where the answer goes, if there is an answer, although you're free to customize it how you want. But yes, divisions is a big deal in the book of 1 Corinthians, and so let's talk some about that with the time that we have left. Okay, we've actually done some of this work already, so we've just keep going with it. What are the images of unity? Some have been mentioned, but we can re-mention them. There's 4 things I have, and if you have other things, I want to hear from you as well. In these verses, as Paul talks about the divisions that exist in Corinth, along the way, as he's referring to those divisions, he refers to what you might call the ideal, what should be the case, or the present, or what the reality is that they are violating by their behavior, however you want to say that. What are the images, the metaphors, the illustrations, the way that Paul refers to a unified Corinthian church? The temple of God? I'd click, but it's not the first one. That's my, if there was a way to click around. Temple is one of the 4. Paul talks about the temple that is primarily in chapter 3, 16, and 17. Do you not know that you are a temple of God and the Spirit of God dwells in you? If any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy. That is what you are. It's an interesting verse to me. Interesting use of the word temple. The temple, we'll get to this when we jump into actually studying the text, but the temple imagery is used again in 1 Corinthians, and maybe more famously, the image of temple shows up in chapter 6, where Paul is referring to sexual immorality and saying, don't you know that your body is the temple of the Lord? Why would you defile that by being with a prostitute? The temple imagery in chapter 3 is not about your body. And there's even maybe some question that in chapter 6 it's only talking about your body. The temple imagery in chapter 3, and again also maybe at times in chapter 6, is referring to us. That we are the temple. The Lord God's Spirit dwells with us. So that's a precious thing. Okay? Another thing that's interesting about that verse to me is that the word that Paul chooses in verse 17 about what the temple is, that means it should not be destroyed, it should not be broken up, is that it's holy. Not that it's strong, not that it's unified, not that it's, loving. Those are the kinds of words we think of as being the opposite of division or the opposite of strife, or whatever. No, he says, you don't destroy the temple of God because it's holy. It's sanctified. It's special. It is precious in God's eyes. So don't you dare come in here and start trying to break it apart, destroy it. That's how that specific warning of divisions is couched in chapter 3. So temple is one image. There's 3 more that I have, and then there may be other ones. Other metaphors, illustrations, images of unity in these verses. Same mind. That's a 5th one. Yeah. That comes from chapter 1, verse 10 and 11. But chapter 1, verse 10, be complete, be of the same mind, the same judgment. We talked about that idea on Sunday. Think the same ways. Rick? The body. That's also not the first one, so I can't click it. But the body is another image that comes up, specifically in chapter 12, and Lee referred to this earlier. You may remember that in chapter 12, that is a pretty thoroughly explained metaphor. He even goes to talking about you might be the eye, you might be the ear, we need each other, you can't say you're better than other parts, the body. Isn't the body the temple is too. The temple is a wonderful image. But isn't the body just a perfect image of what a church should be in terms of unity? Okay? Because you literally can't have a body you can, but you literally can't continue as a body, all the parts, if they're disconnected from each other. Okay? And so it enforces the need and the importance of the design of unity that God has put into the church. Okay? Temple, body. What I have here is a little maybe tricky because it's not as if Paul makes a big deal of it, but he uses this kind of language over and over and over again in most of his writings, but especially I think it stands out in these verses. How does he refer to the people that he's addressing or the people that they're interacting with each other? Their brothers, their family. Notice how many times that comes up, okay? I had the brethren, chapter 1, 10, and 11. He says it twice. Chapter 6, verse 8. You do this even to your brothers. And you probably remember, in fact, the ESV feels the need to point this out every time, that's a neutral word. It means brothers and sisters. It refers to this family relationship. You do this even to your brothers, chapter 6. And that's actually the verse or the idea that Albert was referring to earlier, the lawsuits. Can you imagine? But, we say, well, can you imagine family going to law, court against family? Well, actually, yes, we can imagine that, because unfortunately, that's what happens, when in our world someone dies or there's some problem. But it's a shame, but it can happen in the church as well. Yeah, Jeremy, you have a comment on the YouTube?
Brian says images of unity: 1, same mind; 2, temple; 3, honor all; and 4, do all in the glory of God.
Okay. So we have the same mind idea coming in. And these ideas, this same mindedness, really, I think you could connect to all of these. Okay. Oh, I'll give you that one. But the body was the last one. I thought it was number 3. All of these, again, they are pictures, different pictures of unity. And so if you're in the same family, you're connected, you should think the same way. You should have the same purposes, the same goals. Okay. Same with the temple or with the body. But the church is the last one I had on here. In some ways, not really a metaphor. That's the reality. You're a church. But again, notice how many times that language is used. Chapter 10, verse 32. Give no offense to Jews or Greeks or to the church of God. Chapter 11, verse 16. If you want to be contentious, we don't do that in the churches of God. Chapter 11, verse 17. You come together as a church, there are divisions among you. And then in 14:33, God is a God not of confusion, but of peace in all the churches of the saints. So that shows up several times. And remember that word church is not a super religious word. It simply means an assembly. It's a body in the other sense that we use the word body. Not like your physical body, like he talks about in chapter 12, but like a body of people that comes together, an assembly that gathers together. And we understand that the gathering, yes, that is addressed. In fact, as we'll see, a lot of 1 Corinthians has to do with the literal coming together to be in the same room, to assemble together. But even our right now, being assembled in the same room, in some ways that itself is simply illustrative. It illustrates the life that we're living together in community, that even when we're not in each other's physical presence, we're still a church. We're still assembled. We're still called out, as you may remember that word has at its root, to be one body together in multiple senses of that word. Okay, so I think that there's something going on here. If you see over and over again throughout 1 Corinthians that Paul is referring to the problem of division, then it would be no surprise that over and over again through 1 Corinthians, he's using these images and these illustrations to reinforce, to remind what the church is supposed to be. It is, and we should behave as such. It is a family, the temple of God and His Holy Spirit. It is church, an assembly of unified people. It is a body connected together. Okay. Anything else on this, on the images of unity? Other ways that Paul describes it that you want to contribute, or other thoughts you have about these that I've given you? Okay, alongside this, as we've said, there are also images or different ways of describing the divisions in the church, okay? To some extent, we could just say all of this is about division. That's kind of one way to say, to catch all of these verses. But I do think, at least I think it's interesting to think about, the various ways that Paul talks about the division and see the different kind of nuances that come from each of these descriptions. So, the most common, perhaps, is simply this word division that shows up in chapter 1, verse 10, chapter 11, verse 18, and chapter 12, verse 24. This Greek word is the word schism with an A on the end, at least how we would transliterate it. And what do you think when you think schism? Well, not that we use that word ever, but if you heard it, what do you think of when you think of schism? Some of you are like, I don't think of anything. I don't know what it means. Terry, what do you... Okay. What scissors do. There you go. There's your image. Thank you, Terry. There's your image, scissors. I guess those words are related. Is the etymology of I don't know, man. Terry, there's a whole new world you opened me up to. Scissors and schism, maybe those are connected. But that's what it is. Schism is a break. It's a cut. Separation was another word that Terry used. It's what scissors do. Okay. So think about that idea. Okay, we haven't even said why or for what ends or anything like that. But just think about that idea, separation, scissors cutting. And that up against Paul describing them as a family or as a temple or a body, okay? We won't share any stories about body parts lost to a saw or to a knife or to scissors or anything, but some of y'all maybe have those stories yourself or know some pretty gruesome ones. But maybe that's the image we should have in mind, a separation. Okay, so division, a schism. There's also this idea of contention. And that is the idea that shows up, for instance, in chapter 1, verse 11, when Paul says, there are quarrels among you. That's the same word that then in chapter 3, verse 3, right below it, when he says, for since jealousy and strife are among you, are you not fleshly or walking like mere men? Okay. So this adds another layer. The idea of contention is not just that, maybe you think, maybe we just kind of, everyone goes their own way. Everyone's kind of doing their own thing, and so there's a separation. There's a schism because, you go your way, I go mine. No, this idea of contention gives more flavor to it, okay? What do you think of when you think of contention? What's behind that? What do you imagine's going on when Paul describes contention? So jealousy is one of the words used here. Jealous of what would be my question? What in the world would anybody in a church have to be jealous over? Spiritual gifts. Maybe that comes up in the book. Okay. Why would you be jealous about spiritual gifts? Yeah. Yeah, here's Martin back here, right? Speaking in tongues, speaking other languages. And the gift I got from the Holy Spirit was, administration. That's one of the gifts Paul mentioned. You imagine the apostle just like, I'm going to finally get my spiritual gift from Paul. And Paul's like, I'm giving you administration. You're like, oh, man, really? Can't we trade spiritual gifts? But so we know that might be a subject. But that would never happen today. No one today would ever be jealous of what someone else in the church can do that they may not be able to do, right? That would never happen. So contention. Another word that's very similar, sounding at least, and I think an idea, competition. Maybe that's a word to have in mind, that there is a spirit of competition for whatever reason, okay? The spiritual gifts is one example. I think we'll find other examples throughout the book of 1 Corinthians. A spirit of competition, a spirit of contention exists clearly among the Corinthian church, okay? Destruction. This is interesting, man. I mentioned it earlier, but notice how many times this is not just, okay, we're going our separate ways, okay? There's a separation or a schism. This is not even just, we're competing, right? Sometimes I might say, there's a healthy competition, right? Sometimes it's good, we make each other better, we're competing each other. Notice how many times in these verses, or at least I'll try to point out a few, where Paul says the end is awful. It's things falling apart. Okay. Again, destroying the temple in chapter 3, verse 17. Okay. Maybe we would have images of either the Babylonians or the Romans coming in to destroying, tearing down stone by stone the temple that stood in Jerusalem. Maybe that's what we should think of. When we are competing as the Corinthians are competing against one another, as they are going their separate ways, lining up behind different people, factions in the church. Okay, I'm on this team following this teacher. You're on this team following this teacher. What you're doing is destroying the temple. Okay, but it's not just the temple that gets destroyed, right? It's people that pay the price as well. Chapter 8, verse 11. Notice that one right in the middle of your page. For through your knowledge, referring here, as we'll get to, the eating of meat sacrificed to idols, which you see there's no big deal about doing that because you're so knowledgeable and know the truth about things. But yeah, okay, you have your knowledge, but through your knowledge, he who is weak is ruined. So we're not just talking about destroying God's temple, as if that wouldn't be serious enough. We're talking about someone who's weak, someone who is already maybe struggling to hang on. Their faith is weak, their knowledge is little, and maybe they're on the fringe. Maybe we can imagine who these people are. We can see their faces, we know their names. They're struggling to stay connected to the Lord. They're struggling to stay connected to other Christians. They don't know as much. They don't know as much as me, They don't know as much as the mature Christian. So I can stand here and say, well, this person doesn't know very much. They're weak. Okay? But in the way that these Corinthians are acting, they are ruining that person. And not just anybody, but the brother for whose sake Christ died. And then maybe add into that chapter 14, verse 33. God is not a God of confusion. It's an interesting word. It's like the word for instability. And so again, if we are not, as the Corinthians are involved in behaviors that are selfish and not conducive of unity, it's like you're tearing apart the foundation and causing instability within the church. Not what God called us to, okay? And then the last thing I'll say, it is similar to the idea of destroying. But notice the personal wrong that Paul refers to as well. So in chapter 6, you are wronging, you are defrauding your brother. Okay, this is an intentional, I'm taking what you have, I am going after you, I am doing you wrong. Okay, this isn't just, inadvertently because I'm being selfish, I'm sorry that someone else paid the price and their faith was lost. Again, that's bad enough. But no, when Paul talks about division in the church, he's talking about you are actively taking advantage of these people. You are wronging them. You are defrauding them. back to chapter 8 in that same context. Okay, it's not just, oh, I'm sorry that someone else was offended by what I did. No, he says, you became a stumbling block to the weak. You consciously did something that caused someone else to stumble, someone who was weak. Or in chapter 10, verse 32, you're giving offense. You are actively doing this to somebody else. You are doing them wrong. This is how Paul talks about division. Okay? And I think there are layers here to the character of what's being done, the quality of what's being done, as well as the intensity of what's being done, as well as the result. Thoughts on any of this? Okay, well, here's what I'm going to suggest to you, is that this right here is not only all throughout 1 Corinthians, but you could say it's the thread that runs throughout everything in terms of the topics that are discussed in the book. That maybe, just maybe, every topic in the book comes back to this idea. We'll see. But here's the outline. At some point, I'll probably give this to you in quiz form. That way you have to fill it out, test your knowledge, but then you'll also have it written down and preserved to be able to refer back to. But feel free to write it down now so that you have it for later. Here's the outline that I'll give you for 1 Corinthians. There is an introduction, of course, in chapter 1. And I don't have it up here for the space that I needed to conserve on the slide. But the introduction to 1 Corinthians is much like it is in others of Paul's epistles. We have a greeting in the first 3 verses, and then a thanksgiving. I thank God. It's, by the way, if you're familiar with Paul's other thanksgivings, the one in Corinthians is a little interesting. Okay, Paul is gushing in some other of his openings, like 1 Thessalonians comes to mind, or Philippians. I mean, he's just like, I'm thanking God for you. You're so awesome. You're so wonderful. You know, all this, on and on and on. 1 Corinthians, the Thanksgiving is a little bit more reserved. Maybe Paul's being a little bit, clever. There are things I can give thanks for, but he's careful not to, go too far and say something that wouldn't be true, perhaps. Okay, but there is an introduction, maybe in the first 9 verses or so of chapter 1. Okay, the first part of the book. And you can see this very clearly as you go through and look at where these sections begin. The first part of the book, Paul is responding to reports that he has heard. He mentioned in chapter 1 somebody named Chloe. And Chloe's people have reported to Paul, who's likely in Ephesus, of some things going on in Corinth. And so for the first part of the book, Paul is saying, hey, I heard this. Let me respond to that and tell you what you need to hear about those things. Okay? So, in the first 4 chapters or so, what he's heard about is, surprisingly, factions in the church. Okay? Again, seems to be that the Corinthians are lining up behind different teachers, taking sides, and that is causing factions in the church. And Paul is responding to that in the first 4 chapters. And then in chapters 5 and 6, you could split these up, but they seem to all be related somehow. You could say these are matters of church discipline. But in chapter 5, he deals with a man who's living in open immorality, and the church needs to address that. They need to remove this man from their midst in order to save his soul. And then in chapter 6, they are, they're not handling the situation in chapter 5, and they need to handle it. In chapter 6, they're handling situations that Paul says, what are you doing? Why are you taking these disputes to court? Don't you have a wise person among you that can handle these things? And then the rest of chapter 6 talks about being separate from the immorality of the world and living holy, pure lives. And so, again, I think there's a connection there back to even to chapter 5. But these are things that Paul's heard about, and he's responding to them. The rest of the book, really, at least through chapter 15, is Paul responding to questions that the Corinthians have asked. Okay, we don't have the letter. It would be interesting if we did. But again, we're reading one side of the mail here. So the Corinthians had asked Paul some questions, and so Paul will go through fairly methodically from chapter 7 to the end, answering or addressing these questions. Even in this section, I think there's a division. There's categories here. From chapter 7 through chapter 10, Paul is dealing with what we might call personal matters, questions about marriage. And even in chapter 7, he kind of goes through and says, okay, let's talk about married people. Let's talk about widowers. Let's talk about, people married to non-Christians. Okay, going through all the different situations and addressing each of those. But chapter 7 is dealing with marriage questions. Chapters 8 to 10, and it does seem to carry over into the first verse of chapter 11, but chapters 8 to 10 deals with a situation, or the question, what about, Paul, eating meat sacrificed to idols? Is it a sin, we might say, maybe the Corinthians, is it a sin, Paul, to eat meat sacrificed to idols? And that's what Paul's going to address in chapters 8, 9, and 10. But then in chapters 11 to 14, there are public matters, we might say, or matters having to do with the assembly. That is, when the literal bodies get in the same literal room and worship God together, there are certain questions that the Corinthians have or things that need to be addressed. So, for instance, in the first part of chapter 11, there is some sort of abuse of gender roles in that first section of chapter 11. We'll get to what exactly that might be and what Paul might be saying. But that's the first part of chapter 11. The second part of chapter 11, Paul is very heated about the abuses of taking the Lord's Supper. And so that's what he deals with there. And then in chapters 12, 13, and 14, Paul will deal with the matter previously mentioned of spiritual gifts and the variety of gifts and the problems that could come from that and how Paul says that we should handle that as a church. And then I feel bad. This is such a great chapter, chapter 15, and it seems to always kind of like be hanging at the end of the book. Like, where does it go? Is the resurrection a question that they had, and so Paul is addressing their question? Is Paul just kind of like building to this and saying, I don't care if you ask about this or not, you need to know about the resurrection? It does seem to be pertinent to the Corinthian situation because Paul will say in chapter 15 that there are some among you that are denying the resurrection. So maybe the Corinthians asked about that. They say, hey, we got some people here saying X, Y, Z about the resurrection. What do you think, Paul? And so Paul is responding to that. That seems likely based on where it is in the epistle. Maybe Paul just heard, again, as part of the report, that, hey, there's some people teaching some false things about the resurrection. And so Paul, before the end of the letter, needs to address it. Okay. And then there's a conclusion in which in the first part of chapter 16, Paul will deal with the collection that they need to have ready for the needy saints in Judea, and then with some travel plans and personal greetings in the rest of the closing there in chapter 16. Okay. So part of this was just knowing the outline is helpful. And at some point in our introduction classes, I wanted to show you and talk about an outline and be able to, say we covered it so I can quiz you on it later. But here's the other thing, the reason I brought it up tonight, okay? You look over this list here of the various topics that Paul addresses in 1 Corinthians. Think about the brief things we said about each of these topics. And chapter 1, verse 10 may very well be the thesis of the entire book, okay? Chapter 1, verse 10, now I exhort you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all agree, that there be no divisions among you, but that you be made complete in the same mind and the same judgment. I think you could go through and think through each of these topics and say that if all of these problems, okay, were connected to each other in some way, maybe it's that each of these problems results in or is creating or is exacerbating divisions in the church. Chapter 1 to 4 is easy, okay, the factions. Chapter 5 and 6, they're going to court against each other. That's not helping unity. Chapter 7, perhaps even within families, there is disagreement and disunity about how husbands and wives should treat each other. Chapter 8 to 10, there's a lot of offending going on in terms of people eating or not eating. Men and women, and that competition in chapter 11. Lord's Supper seems like rich and poor are being divided in the way that they take of the meal. Spiritual gifts, they're jealous of one another. Even in the resurrection discussion, some people are teaching a false doctrine, perhaps drawing others to their side. This seems to be what Paul is really getting at throughout 1 Corinthians. In the various forms, the various heads of the Hydra, is that what it is? They all really may be the same monster, which is division, the destroying of the temple of God, disunity among the body. Okay, that's that. So, cross-section 3 is the next page in your booklet. So, work on that. Read through the whole book before Sunday. Look at cross-section 3, and we will discuss that Sunday morning. Thank you guys so much.